Hey, everybody, I'm Susan Lindner, your host of the Innovation Storytellers Show. And today we're going deep. We're going all the way down to the ocean floor. And I'm so excited to have an expert here with me who's going to tell us all about where innovation is happening in places unseen, soon to be seen, and to talk about the future that we hope to see. So I want to introduce you to Kersey Sturdivant, who is a principal scientist at Inspire Environmental. Scientists at Inspire measure the health of the seafloor with novel reconnaissance tools and innovative approaches to problem solving that are directly benefiting the energy revolution in offshore wind. With a hand in all aspects of Inspire's work, Kersey brings critical and creative thinking to everything he does, and he is involved in both the strategic planning and business development, as well as project design, implementation, and presenting his incredible findings to key stakeholders. Kersey pushes boundaries and offers new perspectives in everything he does, balancing his commercial time with his academic pursuits, and has not only been an adjunct professor at Duke University, he also teaches a professor in invertebrate zoology in courses here in the US and on the English Channel, and is a co-founder of an open source science initiative, Oceanography for Everyone. And you can go to oceanographyforeveryone.com, right, and find that there, which communicates science to the layperson, and blogs at the popular site Southern Fried Science, which is my favorite way to eat science, by the way. Kersey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here.
So I got to say, I have never met an oceanographer before, someone who can share with me more about, ocean-based biology, topography, geography, all that exists under the sea. And I feel like so many of my listeners, as we think about everything that's happening with climate change, everything that we are hearing about in the news, we only really hear about the ocean when we are, considering a referendum on wind energy, or we're talking about vats and vats, tons and tons of plastic, rather, that's floating in the ocean, either at the surface or at the bottom. So tell us first how you got into this amazing field of study and the work that you do, and then maybe give us a glimpse of what we should be thinking about when it comes to thinking about the ocean.
Yeah, so I became an ocean scientist. I grew up landlocked in North Carolina, and cast my eyes to the coast and ended up pursuing a career in ocean science that took me on a bit of a whirlwind, where I was exploring as an undergrad numerous internships, studying everything from sea turtles to coral reefs, all the way down to blue crabs and muddy bottoms. And I ended up settling on muddy bottoms. I rejected the charismatic megafauna, and that's what I pursued for my doctoral work. And that's really where my career, as it currently is made up, began, where I was studying the bottom of the ocean, that 99% that makes up the vast majority of the ocean, and studying how humans impact that area both directly and indirectly. And that journey from a professional realm has taken me from academia to the government, working at NOAA, back to academia, where I was a professor at Duke, and then finally joining up with a few guys to start an environmental consulting company, which is what I do primarily now.
Got it. And I heard you say massive charismatic ocean fauna. Is that what I heard you say?
The charismatic megafauna. These would be like
Charismatic
the
megafauna.
dolphins, the whales. Yeah.
This is my new punk band, by the way, Charismatic Megafauna. I just love that. That's incredible. And so that's the route most kids fall in love with, right? When they go to Museum of Natural History in New York and they see that giant blue whale hung from the ceiling, and they're like filled with awe. And
Absolutely.
you're like, no, I want to get to somewhat terra firma or terra moving, right, at the bottom of the ocean floor, and you wanted to go a different direction. So this consulting practice that you have is really about practical applications of what's happening at the ocean floor? Or are you looking at studies of what is going on there in order to inform other projects that are taking place thereafter?
Yeah, so we're involved in a lot of applied work as the private sector tends to be, and there is an element of my personality that really enjoys the immediate gratification that comes from taking my kind of theoretical practice and seeing it play out in the applied realm. And then there's also, a bit of selfishness there where I get that satisfaction of having an impact that I do feel like is having a positive um, impact on our environment, our world. And I love that this trajectory that I've been on has both allowed us to use the kind of theoretical classical approach with which many of our scientists have been trained and take that and give it real world importance. And so for us, we spend a lot of time both dabbling a bit. We have a number of our scientists who have academic appointments like myself. So we dabble still in the theoretical realm and in training students, but then we also spend a lot of time using that knowledge to really study the seafloor and how humans impacted, and more specifically, the work that we've been doing recently has involved a lot with the offshore wind development, or the revolution, as I say, that's taking place right now in America and through many Western countries.
Mm. Yeah. So what should we be thinking about, at a very high level view, if you zoom out for a moment, what are we not knowing? And this is such a broad question. It sounds like as vast as the ocean itself, but when it comes to climate change, what are we not thinking about when it comes to understanding the ocean floor? Like, what do we need to know as citizens first, and maybe as innovators second?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that as scientists, we have a pretty good handle about what's going on with climate change, where we as humans are accelerating the impacts of climate change, and what the forecasts look like. What I think is lacking is a better understanding from the public about what that means and what that looks like. And so the impacts are vast, and we'll hone down specifically on the seafloor. And so if you're looking at an area like a coral reef, it's very obvious. People know a lot about ocean acidification, what that means for the breakdown and degradation of reefs. But those areas make up less than 1% of the total ocean bottom. The rest of the ocean bottom, that 99%, is a mix of sand and mud, soft bottom. And in those areas, a lot of what you're going to be seeing with a changing climate will be quite different. And I think some of the impacts will be related to things like low oxygen zones, or the dead zones that might be occurring or spreading, as well as there'll still be some concerns with relates to ocean acidification affecting different crustaceans that walk around, or these would be like your snails and crabs and shrimp that are walking around on the bottom. And more importantly, I think the bottom of the seafloor is going to be really important from a direct application in its ability to host the tools that we need to really help us combat climate change. And this is what I'm spending a lot of time working on, which is that offshore wind environment.
So when we're combating climate change, I mean, you mentioned the acidification side, right? Which obviously isn't just impacting the coral reefs, right? Just seek out the coral. It's there throughout. When you talk about that acidification, are we talking about the destruction of marine life, for shrimps and snails and things like that? Or are you talking about, if I drain the ocean, right, and I just saw it as soil, is the acidification, and you can tell me if that's not an appropriate analogy, but is that acidification to the earth itself, that sea floor, problematic because of what those soft sandy bottoms are then capable of producing?
A lot of it has to do, short answer, yes. A lot of it really has to do with any sort of animal that has a shell or calcium carbonate structure in it, which is a lot of marine life, is impacted by ocean acidification. And so it's both the loss of organisms, but also even the breakdown in habitat that provides protection and nursery for organisms. You then would also have issues related to kind of just the degradation of other important and valuable habitats like seagrass meadows and these types of areas. So it really becomes this kind of all-inclusive, destructive process on the seafloor. And then that translates, you can think about the complex food web that exists within the ocean, you know, that just ends up cascading up the food web. If you have a reduction in the little small critters, they're food for, you know, smaller fish that are food for larger fish. And you can see how that really can propagate up the food web and really have an impact on the total global ocean environment.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on the insanity that Facebook feeds me and is my algorithm each day. But I saw this morning a 3D printed fish that eats microplastics that a 12-year-old actually created, and it runs on the ocean floor and eats microplastics. And I was like, that's all well and good until a tuna eats your little microplastic eating fish, because it doesn't know it's not a fish. You know? I was like, and suddenly you have a tuna eating all the microplastics and the 3D printed. So sometimes our innovation, and it just struck me as kind of funny working in innovation, that sometimes we get a little bit ahead of ourselves, right? We want to be able to impact change in a way that's having fast and immediate impact. So we want to get it done quickly. We want the immediacy of the results, and we want to be impactful because we recognize the urgency around climate change. The work that you're doing is around offshore wind. Can you just set the stage for us, maybe a little bit historically, about offshore wind? Has been around, correct me if I'm wrong, for about 20 years now, is that?
Or longer in Europe, certainly.
Right. Right. Our friends who in other places on the planet have figured out some things, right? That we're really resistant to adopting. So can you give us a little bit, just a background on the history of this offshore wind and where we are now, so we can get to the innovation part?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, offshore wind is essentially taking a wind turbine that you might commonly see on land and transplanting that offshore. And part of the rationale for doing so is that there's just much more space out there, but also the wind itself tends to be more predictable and prevalent. And when you're off the coast, it's the whole reason why they say bring a jacket when you go on a boat or when you go close to shore, because it's windier and cooler there. And that practice or that application is part of the attraction for why putting these turbines offshore has been this gaining more steam and momentum. And so historically, what's occurred, I would say even globally, is that offshore wind has been a component of a larger energy strategy in places, predominantly in Europe. It hasn't dominated the energy space. And in the US, we've largely shied away from it due to our ability to access cheap fossil fuels. But more recently, within the past 2 decades or so, the cost of energy has really increased. And I say cost, and I use this in a very general term. This isn't just the financial cost of energy, it's the social cost of energy, recognizing the locations where we tend to have to go to get our oil and gas, as well as the political costs associated with it. And so there's been this kind of acknowledgement about what that means and what that cost means to us as individuals, as a society. And that mentality is essentially caught up to what I would say has been the push from the kind of green movement to shift into renewables anyway. And so we've started to look around about other ways in which we can support our energy sector without needing to be overly reliant on pulling up fossil fuels. And so additionally, over time, the ability to be able to get and access those materials has increased in risk. So a lot of the shallow locations where we would drill for oil and natural gas offshore, for example, have already been tapped. And so we keep moving deeper and deeper and deeper. And that raises the risk because you need more and more complex technology to be able to access these reservoirs. And so you can think of a great example, which happened in the Gulf of Mexico, which is Deepwater Horizon, which was a deep water well. You know, it was about, I think, 2,000 feet or so below the sea surface, and that blew out and dumped a tremendous amount of oil and natural gas into the Gulf of Mexico, really creating this massive environmental catastrophe, the likes of which we've never seen before in the US. And that, I think, really kind of was such a great visual about the risks that we're taking due to this addiction or reliance on fossil fuels. And so around that same time, there was really movement in the Northeast around developing kind of a pilot offshore wind project as a proof of concept. Initially, it was targeted around Martha's Vineyard, but the end result was that the project was developed off of Block Island, which is an island that's just a part of Rhode Island, it's just south of Narragansett Bay. Our group was involved in that, and we can talk a bit more specifically about our involvement and our innovation there, allowing that project to reach fruition. But that concept really, I think, lit the fuse under developers in the US to recognize and see that, oh, this is both doable and the energy output and potential here is tremendous. And one of the things that I think people don't think about or recognize is New England or the Northeast as being this kind of energy center. You think about the Gulf of Mexico and the large basin there full of oil and natural gas, or maybe the shale that is in the kind of Western Pennsylvania area that they use for natural gas production. But the energy potential of the Northeast is incredible due to the amount of wind, both intensity and persistence that exists there. And so this small little pilot project of 5 turbines, and they're relatively small turbines, powered all of Block Island. They were able to close the coal plant. They used 10% of the energy from those wind turbines to power all of Block Island, and they transport the rest to the mainland of Rhode Island. And so that moment really catalyzed the offshore wind industry. And very soon after that, you had a number of large federal leases going up for auction. And starting next summer, one of the first large offshore wind farms will be built just south of Rhode Island. It's called South Fork Wind Farm. So right at this transformative moment, this almost inflection point where the scale is tipped and the train has left the station and offshore wind is coming to the US. And of course, the US being the global leader has then led the way in lots of other developed nations pursuing offshore wind as well. Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, the Europeans are doubling down. And of course, the more recent events in Ukraine have also really highlighted the need to disassociate from these less or unsavory states with which we've kind of had these loose alliances and relationships because of our energy needs, and to want to really develop more kind of security for society to be able to wane ourselves off of these off of fossil fuels, which will then help with climate change, and to also provide more kind of self-reliance through the production of offshore wind.
So who are some of the commercial players so we get familiar with some of the names?
Just think of any major oil and gas company, they're all involved in offshore wind.
Is that right?
The energy revolution that's happening in offshore wind is being driven by these multinational energy companies. So Shell, a number of them have rebranded. So for example, Danish Oil and Natural Gas, which was massive, is now Ørsted. Statoil is now Equinor. So these are companies that are forward-looking. They recognize that the usage of oil and natural gas as this kind of predominant energy source this time is coming. The horizon is in sight. And so they're rebranding themselves. They're really kind of doubling down and going all in on the development of offshore wind, especially recognizing that the Western world is the primary energy consumer by and large, although we have some states like China and India that are coming up as well. And so they are really putting a lot of resources, both manpower, energy, materials, into developing these sites up and down the coast of both the US as well as in Europe and in other places in Southeast Asia.
Mm. So,
So Ørsted was probably the one that
mhm.
everyone's going to, become very well known for offshore wind. They're the biggest player, and Shell and Equinor as well. Excuse me.
And that's largely because you need that kind of capital and breadth and expertise, right? It almost has to come from these incumbent players in what were the dirty industries, right? In order to create this new level of clean. Like I was fascinated to learn that every alternative milk, oat, soy, hemp, macadamia, flaxseed, you name it, almost all of them are now owned by Dannon, like Stonyfield Farms, like all of these brands are, cows are not suffering. Your cow companies are not suffering because all of these alternative milks are actually owned by dairy producers. And so
Yeah.
they kind of go hand in hand at this point, right? Simply because they have the scale.
Yes, but also in the US, for a bit of history and context, the market leader was an American company called Deepwater Wind, develops exclusively to produce offshore wind in the US. And they were out competing Ørsted. And so Ørsted, being the big boy, just bought them out, right? Took their knowledge and services. They're doing this better than us. Like, how is that the case? Let's incorporate them and utilize their expertise to ensure that we can then be efficient operating in this space. But what for me was the most encouraging aspect of seeing these large historical energy companies being involved in offshore wind is that it disassociates it from any sort of politics, right? At this point, it's market driven. So when the market decides we're moving in a certain direction, it becomes really, really difficult to stop that movement, that inertia that's built up. And so where it currently stands is that all the major oil and gas companies, excluding the two major American ones, which would be Chevron and ExxonMobil, are invested heavily in offshore wind. And that inertia is going to be nearly impossible to stop. So there is an energy transformation and revolution that's happening. We saw it happen from wood to coal, from coal to oil, a little oil to natural gas. But now the next shift is really going to be from oil and natural gas to offshore wind. That's what I predict.
So tell us a little bit about capacity. When we look back historically on what offshore wind has been able to provide, where is the innovation taking place now? We've seen 20, 30 years of offshore wind in Europe. Where are we now from an innovation standpoint? What's evolved?
I think people are going to find that we are much further along than they recognize. So currently, what's forecasted and predicted, everyone has these 2030 goals. And I think that they're actually very achievable goals, is that by 2030, the state of Rhode Island is expected to be run 100% on renewable energy. And that'll be predominantly offshore wind. The state of New York is expected to be run 70% on renewable energy. And again, I think that's going to be predominantly offshore wind and also very doable. State of New Jersey, 50% renewable. State of Massachusetts. So like all of these New England.
When you say that, sorry, just to clarify, when you say that, does that mean that every state has its own wind turbines producing its own energy? Or is there, Rhode Island has so much wind that it's going to be selling its energy, wind produced energy, to New York and New Jersey?
It's going to be essentially states with wind farms dedicated exclusively to producing energy for them. And if you look at a map that showed the wind farm locations along the East Coast, and this would be from Maine all the way down to North Carolina, South Carolina, there are a lot of wind farms that are going up. And so, some states like New York are going to have multiples of 100 turbine farms coming in, empowering the state of New York. And it really would just be dependent on the size of the state and their energy needs and resources that they have to be able to produce these areas and locations. And what's exciting when you think about what this represents, humanity as a whole predominantly lives coastally. And that's no shade at the people that live in the middle of the country, It just is a reflection on the population dynamics that have all, kind of always existed for humans. And so in building these wind farm areas, what we're doing is really providing a way to run a large portion of society on where the kind of energy infrastructure base is driven by renewables. And that really starts to then lead to these huge transformations in the way that we make behavioral choices like recycling. Part of the issue of recycling is how energy intensive it is. But does it matter if that energy is renewable? Electric cars, now when you plug your electric car in, that energy that's powering that isn't coming from a coal producing plant, it's coming from an offshore wind turbine. So it really starts to transform not just the base of saying, oh, we've got these wind farms that are out here producing most of our energy, even the small behaviors that we make where we're trying to be good stewards have a positive impact because of that base foundation from where we're getting and deriving our energy from is from a renewable, clean standpoint.
Mm. And so those transitions that are now taking place, we have the internal infrastructure in our energy grids and so forth to actually receive wind energy. I know it's always like a question when it comes from solar, right? Like, do we have storage? Do we have capacity? Do we have opportunity? Do all of those factors come into play with wind as well?
There are still challenges with wind. One of the big challenges is going to be where that energy comes onshore. We understand and recognize that there are just not enough locations to plug in for all of the wind farms that are planned. And so there will need to be societal investment in developing and building the capacity to be able to receive this energy that we're producing offshore. But that is, from my perspective, a small price to pay in order to recognize the capacity of our energy resources. If you think about what goes into building and developing some sort of drilling capacity, you always have to build the infrastructure or build some part of the infrastructure to help support whatever energy industry that's occurring. So whenever they're fracking in Western Pennsylvania, they're building roads to these different locations that can support the heavy machinery that's coming in to do the fracking. And so if you're willing to from my perspective, if you're willing to cut down a forest to build a road to support fracking, you certainly should be willing to build a power supply system on the coast to be able to receive the energy that's coming from these wind turbines.
Well, and let's not forget and stagnant pools of wastewater, right? And like all of the yummy goodness that gets left over after pumping tons and tons of water into the ground to make rocks explode, right?
Right.
There are repercussions for those systems that are in place too. We just cease to question them after a while. Well, and there's legal precedent of why we're not allowed to actually question what is the formula that's going into the ground to extract that. But I think we can all agree that the limitlessness of this resource it's not that natural resources certainly aren't a wonderful opportunity. It's the limitlessness of things like solar and wind, right?
Mhm.
It's kind of fascinating to see the limits of human bounded water systems like the Hoover Dam, right? When it comes time to having a drought. And now we don't know if we can actually produce enough electricity because there's not enough water to run the turbines when we dam up the water ourselves. But if we can harness the ocean, right, to give us wind, to give us water power, et cetera, all the better. I was watching a documentary about Spanish restaurateurs who are recognizing that the only way to protect the very important grasses that protect the ecosystem around some of the coast of Spain is to actually farm it and turn it into food in Michelin-starred restaurants and making it a restaurant staple. And this has long been the case of, some environmentalists and some those who are looking to protect species that are going extinct is if you could turn it into food as opposed to a novelty, as opposed to a thing that needs to be gated and protected, you could find a way for humans to respect it, ingest it, and create more of it because they like it. I mean,
Yeah.
it would be nice if we could just understand that it exists in its own right, and that's why we should respect it and keep it. But humans are a little bit more selfish than that, I think. Or some,
Incentive based for sure.
yeah. So what's the consequence if we don't do this, Kersey? What kind of future, number one, are you envisioning that is possible with wind energy? And what's the consequence if we don't go this way? What's going to happen?
So this is somewhat speculative, but I think, well, this first part, the future of of what we could potentially see, I think is pretty lucid in the sense that by 2030, what I suspect you're going to start seeing is that energy prices that are associated with fossil fuels are going to start to drop. When you have major urban dense areas in the US not needing fossil fuels anywhere near to the degree that they have in the past, and again, with these numbers that we're talking about for 2030, 100%, 70%, 50% in some of these large areas and locations, the demand is just going to cease to be there. And we can see from the pandemic that when the demand starts to drop, fossil fuel prices plummet. And the difference will be that demand won't come back. We'll still need fossil fuels. It's not possible, at least in the near future, for us to be able to operate without them. But having a world and environment where you're using fossil fuels in a limited capacity, which I think makes sense, ensures that the price of those goods is really going to be respectively cheap. And then as a result, we're detaching ourselves from the power that the states that provide us with these fossil fuels have over us. So we no longer have to say, turn our head the other way when a repressive state is behaving in a way that we feel is unethical to how we have structured our society. And I think it's going to put the shoe on the other foot, where the demand on those states, if they want to sell us this resource that is now in abundance because the major Western nations aren't, hoarding it up in huge supplies, is going to really allow us to be more selective about who we choose to deal with. And it may be that our demands for fossil fuels are so minimal that we can just utilize whatever we extract ourselves from our own territory. So it really lends itself, at least for America, to a future that could be purely energy independent. And I think that's exciting from a perspective of just being proud as an American, but also when you think about security of our country as well. To not do so is essentially the status quo. And the status quo is dangerous, as we can see in Ukraine, because when these repressive states, these bad actors, continue and expand because they feel emboldened, because they are providing this really valuable resource to what you could consider the world's police, and then they choose to cut it off. I mean, look, the crisis that we're dealing with right now is pretty catastrophic in terms of the energy concerns. The prices are going sky high. There's concerns about energy conservation, cold winters, and that just is really unacceptable. We shouldn't have to trade energy costs for our morality. And so really this allows us to regain that independence to be able to say, you know what, like we've decided to establish a society on a base set of morals, and we want to adhere to that. And we don't have to fudge on those morals because we need to be able to afford and to fill up our cars.
It will come to a point, right, I imagine, where we will not question anymore those, the need either will be so great for fossil fuels, right, as we're putting ourselves in these predicaments as humans, whether it's global conflict or some kind of scarcity event that drives this. We will either put ourselves on the side of not caring, on the moral side, which some might argue we have already, or we'll really have to shift our entire way of thinking to decide it just can't go on this way anymore. And I don't know that the environmental concern is really fueling that at the moment. What do you feel that there's finally some kind of shift, looking at, COP26 and, UN Climate Week was just a few weeks ago. Are we really feeling that impact of people saying, I will do the following for climate. I will change how I live my life?
I think for some, I don't think at a scale that is large enough to make a substantial impact at the speed with which we need it to happen. And what has been a fortunate result or consequence of a really unfortunate situation with the war in Ukraine is that the Western world has really doubled down on renewable energy, because it's become very obvious that reliance on these states with which we have duplicitous relationships really needs to get resolved. And Europe has had offshore wind. It hasn't been at the scale that they need, to be able to not utilize fossil fuels, because they've been able to get such cheap access to natural gas from Russia, which is right next door. And now they're going kind of pedal to the metal to get their offshore wind development up and running in a way that allows them to really cut the cord. And America's looking over, they're seeing what's happening as well. And they're also, charging up and pushing forward with our development of offshore wind as well. You can think about the American response to the murder of that journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, by Saudi Arabia. Brazen murder of a media personality who is just reporting the truth. And free press is enshrined in our Constitution. And this is something that, and I understand this, I'm not blaming the way the politicians handled it, but this is, the response was tepid at best. And it's because of our relationship with Saudi Arabia that is predicated on our need to get relatively cheap oil from them. And so that's just that's untenable. That's an untenable relationship for the US. It's an untenable relationship for the Western world. And the benefit from all of this, as a socially, environmentally conscious person, is that these incidents, as unfortunate and unsavory as they were or are, since the Ukraine war is still ongoing, have really pushed us into this renewable energy sphere in a way that is going to benefit our society and our environment.
So let's talk about, my listeners are all innovators in their own right, predominantly working at large corporations or, consulting with those individuals who do work at large companies, in thinking about their own energy policies and processes. How do we get corporate America to engage more, and specifically when it comes to issues related to the ocean and issues related to energy independence around wind?
That's a good question. I have not put much thought into this, so I don't have, I think that as society, the lay people begin to see the benefits of these wind turbines. So for example, in Rhode Island or in New England, there was a bit of contention around building the first offshore wind farm. And it was, a lot of the contention was related to site pollution. People off the vineyard didn't want to see wind turbines. And so as a result, Block Island ended up being the first location. And what I found to be
community, for those who don't know, right?
What I found to be very ironic about all of it is that the cliff where you can have direct line of sight to these turbines has become a huge tourist attraction because people like to go see them. And so I think that when these turbines start to when these wind farms start to go up, when people start to see the benefit they have to the economy, because there's going to be a huge support cast and structure that's going to be like ongoing in order to support these offshore wind turbines, from production, logistics, supply chain, yada 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 yada. Like they're going to be a boon for these economies in the areas where they exist. And as they see their energy prices start to shift due to a result of it, and just the conversation begins to pick up around it, I think you're going to, in a positive way, I think you're going to see corporations racing to kind of attach themselves to these projects. And so you have the potential to market to these organizations this exact future that will inevitably occur, and try to get that buy-in ahead of time so they can help start be a part of promoting that. So that's an aspect of it. I think you could, I would imagine that in large corporations, there must be some mission statement around conservation or sustainability, and you could try to hold them to that standard by having them be involved and invested in this kind of energy revolution, this renewable energy revolution that's occurring. I do think, though, that it's going to be largely driven by the consumer. As the consumers get more and more excited about the prospect of what this means, you'll see the corporations follow suit.
Yeah. And I think as part of that demand is going to come from the employees themselves, who say, this is important to me. I want to see my company involved in this, and probably ones that are more along the coast, right? That have relevance, they can actually see these wind turbines off in the distance from their gleaming offices somewhere. But do you envision, wind turbines off the coast of Manhattan, or our friends on Wall Street could look out their windows and see them?
They won't be that close, but there are certainly numerous wind farms being planned off the coast of Manhattan. As you might imagine, that place requires a lot of energy. And so there will be a lot of different farms that'll be feeding into Manhattan to help supply that dense region, both New York City and the surrounding locations.
So I'm hearing in the backdrop there, like the Hamptons, probably the wealthy, right off the coast of Long Island, right, where all that wind is gloriously whipping across the sound.
Yeah, the New York Bight, that little dip on the coast right around Manhattan going into New York Bay, is once you get probably 30 miles offshore, that's really around 20 to 30 miles offshore is really where a lot of the farms are being planned and developed. And a lot of the work that we do is taking our innovative approaches and tools to help really kind of map the seafloor and help these groups get a better handle on where they're going to end up building, so they can communicate to the agencies about best practice locations. The whole point of this is that from my perspective, if building these wind farms destroys the seafloor, we're missing the point. And so there's a lot of effort going into ensuring that where we build these turbines has the least impact on our ocean environment. And that's from noise pollution for the migrating mammals, to making sure that we're not destroying essential fish habitat. So there's a lot of effort going into ensuring these companies are mapping out the seafloor. The entire Northeast is going to have been mapped out by the time this is all said and done.
It's pretty exciting in its own right? A pretty fascinating byproduct of doing this work.
Absolutely. And so we are learning a lot. We know a lot. We're learning a lot, and we're ensuring that impact is minimal. And part of what I'm really proud about what we do is that we've been setting the industry standard of how to do this, to ensure that the science is robust, and how you are able to communicate that science is in a very clear and effective way. And so I think it's only going to ensure that we have that credibility with all parties involved. That would be fisher people, environmentalists, capitalists. It's all, everyone involved. I think this is one of these feel-good stories where people can say, what, we're doing the right thing and we're doing it in the right way.
And as long as you can still get a lobster roll, life will be okay. If I can have clam chowder and I can get lobster when I come to New England, you can serve them all up on all the wind farms you like, right? These are the kind of like back to meat and potatoes or lobster and potatoes kind of conversations, right? That winds up.
This lobster roll was produced on wind energy.
Stamped like a little chicken banana sticker right on my lunch.
Yeah, I should have put my little wind turbine on. There we are.
Look at that. Look at that. One for each new subscriber to the Innovation Storytellers show. Get
There we are. There we are.
bell button right now. Kersey, I always ask people who come on the show a couple of stream of consciousness questions, and I'd love to hear the answers to yours. So the first one is greatest innovation of all time. You have a very unique perspective. What do you think is the greatest innovation of all time in the course of history? Writing.
Hands down.
Yes, absolutely. An art form in itself. Mm-hmm.
And then if for modern humanity, I'd probably say vaccines.
You're a germs, guns, and steel man. Yes, vaccines. Love it. Okay. If you could be a member of any innovation team, which team would you join and why?
Anyone working in oncology. I think that I find that discipline to be just fascinating. If you haven't read this, The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddhartha, I can't pronounce his last name. It's a fascinating book about the history of cancer research, and where it's headed. And, I think the work that's being done there is just really fascinating. So
any particular cancer that strikes your fancy, Kersey?
Not really.
Not really. Take all the cancers. Screw them.
I think that the concept of what cancer is, how it operates in the body, and the really kind of cutting edge strategies to try and resolve it are very fascinating.
Yeah.
Things like, bioengineering or engineering the immune system to target the cancers, those kinds of things.
And lastly, something that really pisses you off or something that would give you great joy that you would like to see innovated. So what needs to be invented that hasn't been invented yet that would just make you super happy, or something that frustrates you that someone needs to create an invention to stop?
I think something along the lines of inventing how to teach critical thinking in school, so that people, at the very bare minimum, put a modicum of critical thinking into how they approach decision making across the board. That would be, educational creation or invention and innovation. That to me just is, I find it to be incredibly frustrating, because I recognize that not everyone has a capacity to think like a Stanford researcher or something to that effect, but at times it feels like we're not even trying, and that is incredibly frustrating. And something that I really like and enjoy, I really like my phone, my smartphone. Shout out to Steve Jobs.
You don't need it to do anything else for you that it's not currently doing?
It's probably doing too much, to be honest.
I could really, if you could shovel my snow, that would be awesome. But otherwise, I'm pretty good. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Any parting thoughts you want to offer, Kersey? I mean, because you are in an area, I think, that most of us don't touch in the course of a day, or we certainly don't think about how renewable wind is really going to change our lives. I mean, perhaps some of us are driving a Tesla. Some of us would love to, see more things go green in a particular way. Anything else that you would, in terms of championing this this approach to our energy crisis, what we should be thinking about?
For me, I think the big thing is just patience. It won't happen overnight, and we are very we have a very short attention span as a society. We also have very short memories about lots of things, and so just the patience to allow the process to happen, to not get spun up on any sort of setbacks or failures, because progress is a combination of steps forward and steps backward. And the important thing is that as long as we're trending in the right direction, and right now I think we are, I have no doubt that there will be hiccups along the way, but we will learn from them and continue to move forward, as long as we are all kind of keeping the mindset that we know what our goal, vision, and trajectory is, and we all, are supportive and rowing in that direction.
Fantastic. Kersey Sturdivant, thank you so much for joining me today. Where can people connect with you to learn more about what you do?
You can follow me on Twitter at Wormcam.
Wormcam?
Wormcam, WORMCAM, Wormcam. It's a camera system I developed when I was in grad school. And
are you tracking worms? What is this exactly?
It's essentially allows you to kind of view beneath the seafloor and near real time, and you can kind of just see animals moving about, and we use it to better understand how animals within the sediment or beneath the seafloor function, which has lots of important implications for ocean function and health.
Wormcam. It's like PandaCam, but
yeah, but for worms.
Fantastic.
The charismatic megafauna that I spend a lot of my time working on.
That's right. Our new punk rock band. Kersey, thank you so much.
Thank you.